So many folks.
Hey.
Hi. Just letting everyone in. Gonna spotlight us too.
That's good.
There we go. So many folks. Jeff is here. Marcy is here. Awesome. Erin. Yay. So great. We love seeing everyone on camera, by the way. So I understand if you're, not feeling camera ready, but we like seeing all the folks we're chatting
Like the faces.
Yeah, and just as we're coming in here, if you could make sure that your sound is on mute, that would be grand, just so we don't get a lot of background noise, feedback, all that. Yeah, and if you're open to being on camera, we can talk directly to you. Awesome. Okay, I think that's pretty much everyone at the moment. If some other folks come in, then we'll let people in as they show up. But awesome to see. Oh yeah. Hello, no camera, no worries.
No pressure.
No problem. If you got it, it's cool. Excellent. Well, nice to see everybody. And also if you're not on camera, I see your names. So thank you for joining us. I'm getting over a really bad cold, so if I have to do this, I'll mute myself. If I sound really congested, that is why, but it happens. Anyway, so we're going to do a quick intro, and I have something to show you on my screen, so I will share my screen. And then we will get right into some bullshit busting. We're each going to be pretty short with our BS busting because we want to leave some time for questions. We know a lot of folks are coming in with burning fitness and nutrition and all things vegan questions. So we want to get to those. But first, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page with who the heck we are if we haven't met before, and a little bit of housekeeping items. So we talked about muting yourself. We'll have time to chat later. If you're asking a question, you can ask it in the chat or on camera. And it would be great to see you if you have a camera available. And then the chat, which you should see at the bottom of your Zoom screen, we will monitor that as we're going. So like if Zoe is doing her presentation, I'll be in the chat and vice versa. So don't feel like you need to wait for our Q&A session. If there's something you think of while we're talking, just put it in the chat, and then we will, we'll get to it. We'll scroll through. So, quick intros. I see a lot of new folks here, which is awesome. Some folks we know, some folks are on our team already, some are in our world, but there's some new folks. So yay, thanks for joining us and welcome. I'm Coach K or Karina, whatever your preference is. One of our clients started calling me Coach K like maybe 4 years ago, and it just kind of stuck. I'm like, yeah, that works. So as you know, we are your vegan fitness and nutrition coaches. And what we do for fun, i.e. right now, is bullshit busting. So even though we're part of the fitness industry, we also are very critical of the fitness industry. Look at Coach Zoe, she's like so stoked. So a lot of what we talk about is, how do we make sense of the information overload that's out there? How do we know that something is legit in the first place? Why are some things in the fitness industry not working? And what can we do to positively affect those things? So that's kind of our general approach. I run the No Bullshit Vegan podcast. So if you're not listening to that already, you should. Just nobullshitvegan.com. It's syndicated in radio or on radio in my city, and it's on Spotify and all the podcast channels. And we have Carmen. Hello. Let's do a quick intro of Coach Zoe. If you want to do a quick intro, and then I will do share screen, quick presentation. Remember, put your questions in the chat because we'll get to those. And then Coach Zoe will do also quick presentation, and then we'll have lots of time for Q&A. So, Coach Zoe, what's your deal?
What's my deal? How much time do you have? So I am Coach Zoe, and I was recently, for the first time in my coaching life with Coach K, given the moniker Kozo.
Yeah, by one of our clients. Kozo.
So kudos kudos to that client for coining that. I have been a trainer with Coach K for almost 3 years.
Yeah, something like that.
Something around there. So I train with Coach K. I also have a huge part of my life which is involved with boxing. So I work out of a boxing gym here in North Vancouver. I am a huge fan of kettlebells, tendency, which many of you are familiar with.
Yes. Jeff is like,
double. Hands up for Jeff. And I have been vegan for just over 13 years.
Brilliant. Also, fun fact for folks who don't know, most of the people in our world probably know, but random fun fact is that I met Coach Zoe 17 years ago. So we've known each other for that long, at the exact same time that I met my husband, Murray, because Coach Zoe and Murray used to work together. So it's kind of this interesting network effect.
I'd like to say I played a role in.
Yeah, you probably did. In the whole romantical situation?
Yes.
Probably. Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. I've got something to share with you before I go into some BS busting around sugars. And there's kind of 3 main things in sugars that we're going to talk about. So let me just show you this. If you haven't already, this is my little 5-year anniversary deal. It's the 5-year anniversary of my podcast. In April of 2018 is when I started. Oh, thanks, Kathy. So what I did was put together an ebook for you for free. I'll put the link in our chat that has a bunch of information from some of the folks who have been on the podcast. So Robert Cheek, and here you can see that there is busting soy myths, why veganism is beneficial for strength athletes. So this volume, and there will be more, this one is all focused on strength training and vegan nutrition to support strength training. So it has, it's got a pretty limited focus, I suppose. We'll have other ones about, like deep dives into certain topics in nutrition and veganism itself, kind of the activism portion of it. But yeah, what I will do is I will paste the link into our chat. And if you haven't downloaded it already, you should. Let me just do that right now. There you go. In our chat. Okay, so let's talk about this topic of sugar. So I'm not going to talk about it forever and ever because I do want, I want to make sure that if you've got like specific questions around the topic, you can put them in the chat and then we can answer them. But this has been ongoing since I started in the fitness industry, which is 12 years ago. And it's still happening. Like just last week, someone we were working with was talking about the sugars in fruit and how someone in her family was like, oh, you shouldn't eat fruit if you're trying to lose weight, or if you're trying to affect your body composition, don't eat fruit because it has sugar in it. So this is still out there. And we're kind of going to use some of these points to learn how we can decide whether something is BS in the first place. We'll zoom out from the fruit and the sugar discussion a little bit. So the whole fruit thing, the myths basically, are around, well, there's sugar in fruit, so it's going to spike your blood sugar. It'll insulin spike, it'll affect your health, and it'll affect your body composition, supposedly, negatively, because sugars are bad for us. End of story, right? I think we all know where we're going with this. We want to set the record straight that not all sugars are equal. There's a huge difference between fruit sugars and refined sugars. And then something that we also need to be wary of is assessing foods based on their individual components. So sure, fruit has fruit sugar in it, fructose, but what else does it have in it? It's got fiber, it's got micronutrients. So we can't just look at a food item based on the one thing that it may or may not contain. And so what I wanted to share is that there were a whole bunch of media outlets that were saying things like, oh, fruit will make you fat, make sure you don't eat fruit, which by the way also has a lot of other problematic fat shaming context around it, but Coach Zoe will talk a little bit more about that. Anyways, so these really simplistic, really, headlines were saying, well, a study found that fructose is not good for you, so don't eat fruit. That was basically the headline, right? But then what happens when we look at that actual study? Like, what was studied? What did they find? Who were the participants? So this study that everyone was referencing, which was not that long ago, a couple years, had 16 guys consuming 3.5 grams of fructose per kilogram of weight. So they're not even eating fruit. They're just like chugging solutions of fruit sugar, fructose, basically, right? So there was an author, like a writer, who was debunking some of these media headlines, saying he weighs about 90 kilos. So that would mean if he were in the study, he would have to have 315 grams of fructose per day. And this is like a multi-day, multi-week study. And if he were to get that from bananas, he'd have to eat 45 bananas a day, or he would have to eat 80 cups of strawberries every day, or 800 cherries, or 26 apples. Now, I think most of us are not eating fruit in that quantity. So when we see headlines like, don't eat fruit because it has fructose and it's bad for you, you have to consider that they're simplifying everything. Just by default, a headline will always be a simplification. And you need to ask, well, what exactly did they study? In this case, it was a pure fructose solution, right? So you always have to ask, what did they study? Who were their participants? And does this translate into real life scenarios? Now, I don't know about you, but I'm not sitting around eating 80 cups of strawberries every single day. I mean, maybe I would want to, but I don't think that would be physically possible. So those are just kind of some general questions that you can ask when you see headlines or when you know that something has been simplified. And so what I will paste in our chat right now, if you want to go into more detail about some of these studies, what did they actually look at? What did they find? There's an article on our site about fruit sugar specifically. So I'll just put it in the chat. You can open that in a tab. And it has a couple of debunking / reality checking pieces in there. So feel free to open that up if you want to check it out later. Now I want to zoom out a little bit. We talked about fruit sugar specifically, but what about sugar in general? It kind of has a bad rap as well. So we're zooming out slightly. It's very similar, actually, like thinking about fruit sugar and thinking about sugar in general. There's a correlation issue here, like the whole correlation versus causation. The types of foods that tend to be higher in like processed sugar also tend to be higher in calories. So people are making that connection. The super highly processed foods. Processed food, by the way, doesn't have an official definition, but that's a whole other conversation. So there's a correlation, right? The foods that tend to not have a ton of micronutrients, not have a ton of fiber, and have a decent amount of calories also happen to have your processed sugar, white sugar, whatever you want to call it. Now we need to keep in mind that just because a lot of sugar might lead to negative health outcomes doesn't mean that a little or a moderate amount will have the same effect. So again, we have to ask ourselves, what's being studied, compared to what, and how does this look in real life application? So if you've been around our world for more than about 5 minutes, you probably know that Coach Zoe and I both love dark chocolate, which has sugar in it. Sure, we'll eat dark chocolate 365 days of the year. Now, are we sitting there eating like 3 pounds of chocolate every single day? No. I probably could if given the opportunity, but I'm not. So, again, it's the real world application. How does this look in the grand scheme of things? How does the rest of your diet look? And what's being studied is what we need to ask ourselves. So one more zooming out. We looked at fruit sugar, then we looked at sugar in general. Now we're looking at all carbohydrates. So we're going to zoom out one more, 10,000 foot level. You've probably heard things like carbs will spike your blood sugar, or eating carbs will make you gain weight. And honestly, why we often say carbohydrates is because the word carb kind of has a negative connotation to it, which it shouldn't, but it kind of does, right? You hear about the low carb diets and carbs are bad for you, and carb just tends to have this negative connotation now, unfortunately. Anyways, it's the same kind of approach here, right? So not all carbohydrates are made equal. And plus, we need carbohydrates for things like fiber, which we need for gut health. We're all in the intentional movement world. Maybe we strength train, maybe we do cardio, we're doing some kind of working out. Carbohydrates are the body's preferred type of fuel. So we need them to fuel our training, right? And again, I want to bring up this correlation idea. You've probably heard, maybe even have friends or family members who have said things like, oh, well, I did the low carb diet and I lost a bunch of weight. It really worked, right? So they say it worked for weight loss, it worked for maybe bettering their blood work, something like this. But the question we have to ask here is, what mechanism is causing the outcome? Is it the low carbs? In many cases, it's not. The lack of carbs is not what is actually causing the outcomes, whether that's weight loss or, better blood sugar levels or what have you. It's usually the resulting calorie deficit, right? If we're not eating carbs, then we're probably not eating a lot of more processed snack foods, which are not inherently bad, but in a certain amount, they're probably not in line with our goals. So the correlation here is, again, a lot of the foods that folks are cutting out when they're on a supposed low carb diet happen to be the ones that change their blood work numbers. It's not the carbohydrates themselves. So compared to what is a super important question. And the last thing I want to show you here on my screen is something from examine.com. Do folks here know examine.com? We've mentioned it, I think, in our last lunch and learn type session. If you don't know examine.com, I highly recommend checking it out. It's an independent research organization. So they have no advertising. They're not affiliated with any sort of industry. And they compile research that's been done on supplements and on different types of diets and like everything in the nutrition world, basically. So they show you what research has been done, the quality of said research, and the results that that research found. So you don't have to go and pore over all these peer-reviewed articles yourself. So I wanted to show you this kind of interesting thing, might surprise you. This one is going over a study called Are Low Carb Diets Better Than Low Fat Diets for Weight Loss? This is one of these big, debates in the nutrition world. Which one's better for fat loss? So this is a summary of the research that's been conducted on this topic, because many people use low carbohydrate diets for weight loss. It's like a big topic in the nutrition world, right? Now, this is a meta-analysis, which means a whole bunch of different studies are aggregated and they look at tons and tons of different participants. Now, check this out. You can read this. Actually, I'll put the link in the chat too if you want to check it out. But look at this. At first glance, it says one thing, but then if you read into it a little bit more, it says something completely different. So at first glance, let's look at this. Compared to low fat, high carbohydrate diets, low carbohydrate, high fats diet resulted in a greater weight loss and a greater increase in HDL, which is generally considered the healthy cholesterol. Okay, interesting. So some people would stop here and say, oh, well, this diet was better for weight loss. The low carb diet is better for weight loss. Okay, but look at this. It is notable that although weight loss was greater in the low carb group, fat loss did not differ between groups. Interesting, right? So this is again a reminder that scale weight does not actually tell us what is going on with someone's physique. What they're saying here is the difference in weight loss might actually be due to decreases in stored glycogen and water related to processing carbohydrates, which makes total sense if you're on a low carbohydrate diet. So it's kind of interesting, right? Some media outlets maybe picked up on, well, the low carb diets are clearly better at weight loss, which I guess is technically true. But weight loss doesn't translate necessarily into fat loss, which is what most folks in this world going on a diet are aiming for, right? So I will put that link into our chat if you want to look at this in more detail. And then I will turn things over to Coach Zoe. And I see some folks are already putting in questions. So we will come back to those when we do our Q&A. All righty. Coach Zoe, we're going to do some BS busting on fats, which is another huge topic.
I also need to share this just because it's very pertinent based on what you just discussed. And to preface, this is by no means throwing shade to anyone who has done raw vegan at any point, but I did that once. And the one thing I remember so vividly was eating so many bananas. I felt like they were coming out of my pores. So when you mentioned those numbers around banana consumption, raw vegan.
Yeah, but you weren't eating 45 bananas a day though, were you?
Maybe not 45, but there are some days where I felt like I was really darn close.
All right. Fair enough.
Okay. We are going to talk about fat. So first thing I would like to do is get some quick audience participation. So from folks who are on screen, you can put up your hand. And then for folks who are off screen, just throw in the chat, yep, or a check mark or something like that. So that is, put your hand up or, put your comment in the thread if you have heard any of these terms before, okay? Fat-free, low fat, no fat, non-fat, half fat, removed fat, and every single variation of all of the above, right? So
all of that. Yes.
All of those. And I probably missed a few of the very creative other terms that they have in the mix. So we all know already that there are a lot of myths and there is a lot of false information about food and nutrition, which is perpetuated by the fitness industry on a broader scale. And fat, specifically how we perceive fat and what we know about it and how we talk about it, is one of those things. So we hear about these foods, we hear about these diets, we hear about all of these methods and strategies to reduce fat or remove it entirely, when in actuality, there are a ton of benefits to having fats in the diet, and B, there are some potentially very detrimental outcomes to consider when they are reduced or when fats are removed from the diet entirely, right? So I'm going to run through 5 main points that speak to where a lot of the misunderstanding has occurred and how we can start to reframe and reshape our relationship with fats, right? Number 1, we need, our bodies require a base level of fats in our diets. So in no particular order, and I clarify, this list is not exhaustive, fats assist with lowering the risk of heart disease, improving blood cholesterol levels, helping with blood sugar control, reducing inflammation. They give us energy. They protect our organs. They support cell growth. They're good for our skin. They're good for our hair. And this one is extra important. They help our bodies to absorb fat-soluble vitamins. So specifically, that is vitamin A, that is vitamin D, vitamin E, and vitamin K. So when we pivot to the other side and we look at the potential negative impacts of having reduced fat in the diet or no fat, and again, I preface with this list not being exhaustive, So we're talking about things like compromised brain function and cognitive ability, reduced vitamin absorption. So for the fat soluble ones, as mentioned previously, but for other vitamins as well. Hormone imbalances, impact on satiation and increased appetite, mood imbalances, dry skin, and overall, we're looking at a weaker immune system in general. Number 2, and stand by for the numbers on this one. Fat contains more calories per gram than protein and carbohydrates. So folks learn about that, or they see that, and they immediately become very apprehensive. So specifically, we're talking about 9 calories per gram for fat. Carbohydrates, we have 4 calories per gram, and that is also the same for protein, 4 calories per gram. So this automatically creates situations where the pervasive rhetoric may be something along the lines of, well, fat has double the calories of carbohydrates and protein, so you better watch out, and similar statements. Now, the first part of that statement is true. It does have just over double calories, but that doesn't mean that it's coming for you, and it doesn't mean that it's inherently bad, right? Fats can be present and should be present within a well-rounded diet. Point number 3. This is a super fun one. I actually wrote a note here that says we could spend an entire session talking about just this one, and we definitely could. But this is the belief that eating fat automatically leads to fat gain. So I'm going to bust that with 3 main responses. Number 1, eating one nutrient specifically does not inherently lead to weight gain. Weight gain, which as a friendly reminder is not inherently bad. We all have different areas of focus with what we are hoping to do with our body. Weight gain is caused by eating calories in an excess. So they can be from fats, they can be from carbohydrates, or they can be from protein. Number 2, for folks who perhaps are looking to prioritize a shift in body composition and perhaps have some fat loss and some muscle growth, fats can actually assist and can be a great ally in that process because of their satiation properties. I'm going to throw in a quote from Desiree Nielsen, who is absolutely brilliant. She is a local Vancouver-based vegan and plant-based RD. So that stands for registered dietitian. And she has this quote in an article titled, "Here's How to Feel Full on a Plant-Based Diet." And one category in that article is titled, in all capital letters, "Eat Fat!" exclamation mark. She writes, "Just like fiber, fat is broken down slowly in the body, keeping us feeling full and energized into the evening. If you've ever been starving post-smoothie, even if it has protein, you might want to add a bit of almond butter. If you're on a 100% plant-based diet, consider eating more whole plant foods like avocado, olives, and nuts in place of starchy foods to feel full." This advice might feel a little hard to digest, pun intended, after living in a low-fat, no-fat world for the last few decades, but rest assured it is not the amount of fat you eat, but the type and overall balance of nutrients. I will link to that article after we jump into the questions, and she also has a bit more information and a few examples of what some of those good plant-based fats are. Third point, falling in line with rhetoric like this. So this is coming back to the notion around eating fat leading to fat gain. falling in line with that rhetoric upholds very, very harmful belief systems, which are inherently rooted in fat phobia. So for folks who may be newer to that term, fat phobia is the fear, or for some, it's the hatred of folks who are living in larger bodies. So I mention this because I believe on some level that the societal fear that we have of fat is rooted in the societal tendency to uphold fat phobic tendencies. So Coach K and I are aware of this. You know, we're hyper aware of this in the industry, but we mention that as a reminder that there's a lot we can do to combat that on a systemic level, but also to reflect what we're doing about that in our daily lives for everyone present here as well. And two more, which I will be very concise with because I am mindful of time, Coach K. And number 4 is oils are not the devil. Okay. A lot of the demonization of oils has evolved from the prevalence in whole foods, plant-based diets. Within a lot of those diets, there may be low oil consumption or there may be no oil consumption. So this has led to this overarching fear of all oils and the assumption that all oils are inherently bad. And again, there is nothing inherently wrong with a whole foods plant-based diet, but we do flag them when they contain no fat for reasons as mentioned above. So another thing myself or Coach K will throw in the chat is one of my all-time favorite episodes of the No Bullshit Vegan podcast. It is episode number 144. Coach K talks with Dr. Matthew Nigra, who is a fantastic local vegan MD. And the name of the episode is Dr. Matthew Nigra on Oils, How Research Was Misinterpreted and What It Really Shows. So that title is very self-explanatory for the content, and it goes into a very thorough deep dive of that conversation as a whole. Last one, fats are not a monolith. So we have unsaturated fats, we have saturated fats. Saturated fats, which often are referred to as, let's say, the problematic ones, or the areas where when we have high consumption of them, that's when we have a bit of concern. The majority of those are found in animal products and animal byproducts. They are also found in coconut oils and palm oils. So this is not to say that every vegan fat source is inherently awesome, but it is to say that if you are getting your fats from plant-based sources and not those animal-based sources, which have saturated fat, you're already in a very different position and a very positive position than if it was the opposite. And the last thing I will mention, this goes without say, there will be folks for different reasons regarding their personal health histories or certain medical situations where eating a low-fat diet is recommended by their doctor. So obviously, when we share information about something like this, when we share information about anything related to nutrition, it's also with a friendly reminder that when you are looking to shift anything within the way you're eating, it's always a positive to check in with your doctor and make sure that the choices that you're making are in line with your respective medical histories. And scene.
And scene. Love it. Thanks, Coach Zoe. So we have a couple questions already in the chat, so we'll go back and we'll address those. But if you have any cues on fats, on carbohydrates, on anything else in the vegan / strength training world, now's your chance. So throw them into the chat. We will go over them. And if you have a question that you would rather ask verbally, just put in the chat, I can be on camera or I've got a cue, and then you can unmute yourself and ask in person if you'd prefer that, if it's easier than typing. But we will go through the chat. So I'm just scrolling back. So when we were talking about sugars, Jenny's wondering about stevia, and Marlene had a question about monk fruit sweetener. Shara is asking about the latest reports on erythritol. So I actually pulled up something about that. Funny that Coach Zoe mentioned Dr. Matt Nagra because it's from him actually. So why don't I do that one first? Stevia and monk fruit, we're not registered dietitians, right? So our scope of practice is to look at nutrition from a fitness lens, from a general health lens, right? So we can look at someone's nutrition and suggest basic tweaks to make your diet more in line with the training you're doing and more in line with the fitness results that you want for yourself, your physique results, your strength results, all that kind of stuff. Now, what we can't do with our clients, at least, is look at, like blood work from someone. We can't prescribe certain diets for folks. We can't look at micronutrients, so your vitamins, your minerals, and suggest like, oh, you should be on an iron supplement, or oh, you should be on a zinc supplement. That's outside our scope of practice. But what we can do is, again, look at your overall diet and make suggestions so it's in line with the general health goals and the fitness goals that you have. And we can also point you toward research that's been done on a certain topic. So that's what I'm going to do for the headlines that have come out relatively recently, like over the past few months, which is what Shara is asking about. One of these artificial sweeteners was studied and supposedly found a connection between intake of this erythritol and cardiac events, so like heart attacks and strokes and stuff. So what I will show you here, I'm not going to show you the video, but I'll just show you Matt Nagra's YouTube channel. I'll put this into the chat as well. This is a short, it was also a reel on Instagram, so if you don't follow Matt Nagra, make sure you do. Here's his channel, Dr. Matthew Nagra. He's honestly one of the only naturopaths, probably the only naturopath that I will ever have on the podcast, because there's a lot of questionable, not science-based stuff that goes on in the naturopathy, how do you say it? Naturopathy world. But what Matt does is he takes studies, he takes headlines, and he does a deep dive into what was actually studied, what were the results, and how was it presented in the media, and was it accurate or not. So in this case, what Matt did was look at the actual study, and he also reminded us that we naturally have erythritol circulating in our bodies because our bodies make it. So this particular study did find a connection between cardiac events and blood levels of erythritol, but it had no way of differentiating between the supposed sweetener that people ate and the molecule that their bodies made. So sure, maybe blood levels of this compound are related to cardiovascular events, but we don't know if that's from eating it or not. So we can't take that next step and say eating it is bad for you, right? Because the study didn't make that differentiation. So that's a pretty important point there in how the research was carried out. So if you want to watch the video, I will put the link into our chat. You're going to have like 15 tabs open after this. And subscribe to his channel too. He's awesome. He was on the podcast, as Coach Zoe mentioned. So yeah, I would defer to research experts like him on topics like that. And then stevia and monk fruit, we're not nutrition experts in like individual nutrients. There's not the same level of BS or myths around things like stevia and monk fruit, because I think, this is my theory, they don't have a ton of calories. I don't think stevia has any calories, actually. So the whole myth around, carbohydrates are bad for you or sugar is bad for you, is often correlated with the fact that they're high calorie, which again is not inherently bad, but also doesn't line up sometimes with the goals that people have. And there's probably been some research finding links between stevia consumption and diabetes, for example. But again, you have to look at what they studied and did they control for variables like total sugar intake? Like I have a sweet tooth, for example. I have like 32 sweet teeth. It's ridiculous. So I eat a lot of stevia because it's sweet, but maybe I also eat a lot of refined sugar. I like to think I moderate my refined sugar intake, but there's all these extraneous variables that could be part of the mix. So you know what I would do actually on the monk fruit and stevia is go to examine.com, type that into their search bar, and see what comes up because it will show you what's been studied. And they're way more on top of the research than we are. Okay, let's scroll down because we have a bunch of links here. Okay, Coach Zoe, here's a good question from Mike. Do you want to tackle this one? How do you determine a healthy ratio of fats and carb targets to match your like daily energy expenditure?
I will answer that, and I may kind of merge into Marcy's answer as well, because Marcy's question rather, because those two answers are connected. So when we're working with clients who have a nutrition focus, we have certain ratios calculated that we usually work with, certain percentages. So we've determined our percentages based on two main factors that are very pertinent to the majority of folks in our community. So number one, we are working with folks who are vegan and or plant-based. And number two, we are working with folks who are doing a certain volume of strength training within their week. Whereas, let's say if we were working with someone who had a very significant endurance training focus, and maybe they were training for a triathlon or something like that, their macros would look a little bit different. So we work with 50% carbohydrates, we work with 20% protein, and then to answer this question specifically, we work with 30% fats, right? And I'll kind of segue into Marcy's question as well. So when we work with those aforementioned macros, we always put a lot of focus on protein. Obviously, this is something that as vegans and plant-based folks, if we had a nickel for every time we heard the word protein and where do we get it from, we would be rich. So when we are discussing macros, protein is kind of the priority. The reason that protein is the priority is that for folks who may have areas of focus around body composition or putting on muscle, protein is going to be your number one ally in doing that. So with the carbohydrates and fats, if there is a little bit of fluctuation, we usually say perhaps 10% in either direction, that's fine. The macro where we want to see the least fluctuation is protein. If we were hypothetically working with someone and perhaps we observed that they were going way, way, way over carbohydrates and way, way, way over fats, that's when we would suggest having a discussion, check in on that, and address it and see if we could change anything up. Because when it gets to that more dramatic variance, that's when it could potentially impact areas of focus. But those little fluctuations, more fats one day, more carbohydrates the next day, won't have long-term negative impact.
Yeah, if we're controlling for calories, which is what Marcy asked in her question, right? If calories are the same, if those are being controlled for, unless it's this huge difference, you know, like 70% of your calories coming from carbohydrates or something, then it won't have an effect on your results if also the protein is taken care of. So there's a couple of caveats. By the way, speaking of protein, have y'all used our vegan protein calculator yet on our website? So what a lot of folks will do, especially if they strength train, is they'll figure out their protein needs first, and then they'll fill in the rest of the calories essentially that they have available with carbohydrates and fats. So I will put this into our chat as well. But basically, I mean, I don't know, let's just do a sample 170 and maybe a moderate. You can adjust as you see fit here. This is based on information from 3 different research organizations, so we aggregated it. And we are going to do a slightly higher amount of calories if you're in a calorie deficit. So if you're currently in fat loss mode, you'll need a little bit more protein, A, to make sure that you're not also losing muscle, and B, to make sure that you're well satiated, feeling full on fewer calories. So it does make a little bit of a difference. And then there is some research that shows folks who are plant-based will need a little bit of more total protein just for digestibility and absorption reasons. But it's not a ton. It's not a huge difference. So we're just going like covering all of our bases. This is probably the highest amount of protein you would need. And so some folks will do that first instead of just a blanket percentage of their calories. But very often it works out to that exact ratio that Coach Zoe was talking about. So I will put that in our chat in case you want to take a look. Calculator is awesome. Thanks, Jenny. Okay, now there was another question here. David is asking about what we think of Mercola's campaign against polyunsaturated fatty acids. Okay, don't get me started on this dude. So I'm already biased because this guy is not evidence-based. So I already have well, whatever he says, I'm not going to listen to outlook. So just full disclosure. I don't actually know about his campaign against polyunsaturated fatty acids. But again, one of the resources that I would recommend is Matt Nagra. So his various debunking videos, and I'm sure you could search Dr. Matthew Nagra and polyunsaturated fatty acids and he'd have a bunch of content. Or you could go to examine.com and they will have aggregated research on health effects. But there was some very problematic vaccine related discussion from this dude that just makes me think he's out to make money as his first priority. But that's just me. I would go to something like examine.com. Okay, so any other questions? I think we've covered the ones that are in the chat.
I have a question.
Oh yeah.
And folks can answer or type it in, but I'm curious if you feel comfortable sharing, was there a specific belief or assumption that you may have held about sugar or fat coming into this, and you will be leaving maybe thinking a bit differently about that specific assumption?
That's a good question. I think we're all still working through a lot of assumptions that we have, right?
I binged on the podcast. Valid.
No, because I binged on the podcast. You're awesome. The usual, they're bad for you, says Jenny. Now I know better. Excellent. Okay, see? A lot of what's out there is fear-based, right? Like fear, they're bad for you. They're going to have negative effects. It's very fear-based. And that's not really something we feel is psychologically healthy to have associated with food. I mean, sure, there are ways to eat that are more or less in line with the goals you have for yourself. That's just reality. But a lot of what we try to do around this bullshit busting directly addresses these fear-based ideas. And a lot of them are fear-based because they get views, they get likes on social media, they're like sensational.
Mhm.
Okay, so Jeff, good question. Could you please walk us through a naturopath, their training and emphasis on how it is different from an MD? You know what? We talked about this with Matt in the podcast. So if you listen to, what was the episode again? 144, I think?
144.
44, yeah. I don't even know.
It's
yeah. The first part of that conversation, so before we even get into the BS busting around oils and stuff, is what's the training like? I think it's a 4-year degree program. But I'm no expert in it, so I think, getting it from someone who actually did the program is probably more useful. And yeah, so if you listen to the first part of the episode, it'll cover that. Oh yeah, okay, so Marlene has a good point. Reading many books on healthy diets for people with PCOS, and many of these books demonize carbs. That's a good point. That's a good point. See, so again, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, we're our brains are
thing.
connected, so you're probably going to say the same thing.
Yeah.
I would respond to this kind of touching to what I said at the end of the fat presentation. There will be certain medical considerations where eating different amounts of, certain foods or food groups or macros will be beneficial for that. I cannot say that I have done an extensive deep dive into PCOS and nutrition. So it may in fact be feasible that for some folks who have that, eating an adjusted volume of carbohydrates is a positive option. I would suggest for anyone here who navigates PCOS, Dr. Dylan Cutler. And she is here in BC. She's based on Vancouver Island, and she has done her PhD on PCOS and is vegan. So there's a very interesting intersection of those two subject groups.
Yeah, she's a great resource. We have referred a client to her resources and expertise for sure. Yeah. Okay, Eric has some awesome questions. I'm going to go through them real quickly. But Eric, similar to last time, if you want more details, I can email you after. But just for now, if you were in our first Lunch and Learn last month, you will know that weighted carries are one of the 6 fundamental strength movement patterns we need to have in our workouts. Not every single workout, but your training week needs to include 6 fundamental movement patterns, one of them being weighted carries. So Eric is asking about weighted carries. Is it important to do shoulder mounted, which is like a kettlebell, I assume, right? Like a racked carry? Or is the farmer's carry sufficient for essential purposes of carries? So I would say the more variations you're going to do of carries, the better. I don't have a ton of gym space. My gym is, I think it's like 16 feet by 10 feet. So it's a decent space, but it's not enough to do like a ton of walking lunges or a ton of walking around with weights. So what I do is I take 2 kettlebells out to my sidewalk in front of my house, and I just do my weighted carries at the end of my workout, like up and down the sidewalk. Neighbors probably think I'm nuts, but anyway. I would do as many different variations as possible. So if you have access to kettlebells, do your racked carries like this. That'll get more shoulder involvement. You can do a dumbbell overhead carry, like a waiter's carry, it's often called, like way up here for your shoulder. So I would mix it up because you're getting different benefits from different types of carries. And the main benefit of carries, by the way, is integrating your upper body with your core, grip strength, and overall like stability development, which will translate into your big lifts like your squats and your deadlifts. So if you're not doing some form of carry, whether it's kettlebells, dumbbells, the hex bar that you can use for deadlifts where you stand in the middle of it, you can deadlift, you can use that for a weighted carry. There's tons of different options. So again, Eric, can you copy these questions and email them to me? Because I want to make sure that we go over other things as well. But just really quickly, you're asking about core strength. If you're building core strength, is it important to do exercises that directly target the core, or is it enough to do your big lifts? Now, as someone who has as Coach Zoe would call it, a unique lower back. And as someone who does core work specifically to be a better swimmer and to prevent low back pain, I'm going to tell you that actual core work, your leg lifts, your hanging leg lifts, your bicycle crunches, your planks, is absolutely necessary if you want to have a strong core. So yes, big lifts will work your core, but it's not quite enough if you want to get to that next level of like spinal support and athletic performance and all those other benefits. So I would do dedicated core work. Now, how that looks might be different for different folks. You might do it for 5 minutes at the end of a workout. You might do it on a non-workout day by itself, but I would do core work for sure. And then I'll answer your lunges question. How does one determine how far apart to place their feet along both the X and the Z axes? That's a good question. Okay, so you want to be train tracking your feet. So they're along your hip line. You don't want to do your lunges with your feet really close together in this plane, if that makes sense. So you want to have your feet hip width apart, and then you step back with one foot in that same plane. And then how you know how far apart to have your feet is at what angle your knees are. So you want to have your front knee and your back knee both at 90 degrees. And so different leg lengths relative to torso lengths will mean everyone's lunge looks kind of different. So I can't give you like, well, you need to step back 3.67 feet exactly. But you want to have both of your legs, the front one and the back one, at 90 degrees if possible. But again, just copy your questions, paste them into an email, and we can go into more detail. Okay. Douglas has a good question. Coach Zoe, you want to go into past doctors stated that the body makes the cholesterol the body needs, so why eat additional fats?
I would actually respond to this with two different answers. So number one, when I'm responding to a particular statement or article, especially if it's from a doctor, I never like to do that without having actually read the article and knowing who that doctor is. So perhaps if you have the link to that, would you be able to share it with us, or perhaps you could send it to us?
Well, it might be a past doctor of Douglas's though, not like a random person on the internet.
Oh, sorry. Yes. So, I mean, and Coach K may want to add something onto this. The body does produce a certain percentage of cholesterol, but we still need to intake some additional fats to make sure that our body is being fueled to support all of those aforementioned processes that we talked about at the beginning of the presentation.
Yeah, so I guess the take-home point is cholesterol is not the only reason we need to eat fat.
Yeah.
We need to absorb fat-soluble vitamins. We need them for cognitive health, especially your omega-3s. We need them for like the nervous system. So there's other reasons other than cholesterol.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Lots
okay.
going on.
I want to share one thing, which we did also last time because I'm aware of our time here. And that is for new folks. I see a couple of new faces here. Thanks for joining us. Yeah. If you are at all interested in working with us as coaches, we do have a couple of spots right now. So as you probably know from our various corners of the interwebs, we do fitness and nutrition coaching with folks who are somewhere on the plant-based spectrum. So you don't have to be fully plant-based, but somewhere, plant curious, already vegan, somewhere in that world. That's the folks we work with. And so as a thank you for being here today, if you're a new client or you're interested in becoming a client and you fill out an application form, because we do make sure that we're good at fits and we do a little chat beforehand. If you fill out your application form within the next 48 hours, so what's today, Thursday? So by Saturday at 2 p.m. Pacific.
On the dot.
Yeah, on the dot. Regardless of when you book in your call, even if it's the week after or whatever, as long as you get your application in the next 2 days, we have a top secret 15% off any coaching package just for being here today. So just make sure you mention it. It's not like officially on the website or anywhere else, actually. But just so you know. And I will put in the link to our application form into our chat. We have an awesome team of vegan folks from all around the world, some of whom are on the call right now, like Marlene and Carmen and Jeff and Marcy. There's probably more who are not on camera. Awesome folks. So yeah, just wanted to mention that. And if you have any other questions, feel free to email me, Karina at karinainkster.com. You can go to our website. There's a contact page. You can send a message through there if you have other questions. And thanks for the thanks in our chat. Great to see everyone here. And we will have a replay too, so we'll send out the link to the replay if there's someone you know who wants to get in on the fat and carbohydrate discussion. It'll be on YouTube shortly, but I'll send it out so we all have it.
And just to tack on, if you have any ideas of what you would like to see covered in future sessions, please feel free to share those with us as well, because we want to prioritize sharing information that the people want.
Hey, that's a great call. Yes. Any BS busting you want, any topic that's, in the media or top of mind for you, we're for sure game. Ooh, how to read labels, Jenny says. That's a good idea.
Yeah.
Good idea. I like it. Yeah, so any questions, bring them on.
Food packaging could be a
food
whole...
packaging. Yeah. Well, you're getting the wheels turning already. Love it. Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for being here. Hope you have a good rest of your day. Nice to see you all. And we'll see you in various different capacities. But get in touch anytime, and we'll chat with you soon.
Thanks, everyone. See you soon.
Everyone.